Hello there ladies and gentlemen, I'm Paul TX141 Walsh, welcoming you to an all new World of Warships gameplay today on our channel. In this episode we're setting sail in the Tier 6 American aircraft carrier known as the Independence, in a Tier 6 domination game on the map Ring. The purpose of today's gameplay is for us to talk about the concept of aircraft management, i.e. keeping your planes alive for as long as possible so that way you can have a continuous impact throughout the course of the match, rather than just an early impact at which point you lose the majority of your planes and you're of no benefit to your team as the game wears on. To do so, we're going to be also talking about some of the elements of the Independence, whereby in particular we know immediately that the reload timer on our bombers is much shorter than on our fighters, whereby we have a 25-second reload on our torpedo bombers, 32 seconds on our dive bombers and 40 seconds on our fighters. And this in turn means that from the start I'm going to be focused on keeping my bombers alive because I know I can reload them faster and therefore I can do a lot more drops than I'll be able to do with my fighters, which take longer to reload. And if anything, my fighters will act as a screen for my bombers, and at the same time, where possible, I'll send my fighters hunting the enemy bombers once the enemy aircraft, i.e. the fighters, are no longer a threat. So what you'll see is I'm going to be positioning my bombers over towards the western elements of my team, so that way I'm given some anti-aircraft protection, because I expect my opponent, the enemy Ryujo, will be able to get their fighters up well before I can. And in turn, if that means that I could send my bombers into the centre of the map, but they get caught off guard and have no means of protection and ripped apart early on, it's not favourable. Instead, I want favourable trades, whereby if possible I don't want to lose any planes whatsoever. If I'm going to lose one or two bombers, for example, I'll be able to take out an enemy ship or at least take away half of its health. Alternatively, if I'm going to lose a fighter, I'll take out all the enemy fighters in return. Or at least that would be the ideal situation. And what we can see is my thoughts about the enemy fighters being able to see us early on have rung true, whereby they brought their fighters quite close towards the centre of this side of the map, i.e. down the western side, and I'm positioning my fighters in towards the centre east section. Now you may be wondering at this point, why am I doing this? What I've noticed is my team are migrating eastwards. Now the enemy team as a result will send a significant force to attack my team over in the eastern side of the map, and we can see our fighters are already spotting this reactionary force. In return, what this means now is the enemy fighters, if they want to come down into the southeastern corner to spot my team and at the same time attack my bombers, they will need to go through my fighters. There is no other way round unless they want to go through my team's fleet and therefore all the anti-aircraft conferred. This means I now have an opportune window in which to attack the enemy ships that have made their way already down onto the Foxtrot line of the minimap in the bottom right hand corner of your screen. And in return, the enemy fighters will need to cut across my fighters in order to be able to defend. This buys me time, this buys me the opportunity to take a breather and understand what can I do to strike. But at this point I decided to pull my bombers back because I've noticed in particular the Duca d'Aosta, with its defensive anti-aircraft consumable, being quite close to the enemy ships on the Foxtrot line compared to the Duca's southernmost position. So what I want to do is try to avoid bumping into that and attack, say, the enemy Fuso or the enemy Königsberg. And in the meantime, with the enemy fighters coming down, I'm sending my fighters to chase. But you'll note here that the enemy fighter squadron strafes my fighters a little bit too close, meaning that the strafe is ineffective and it now means I can lock up those enemy fighters. But before I go any further, I'm going to take away all other elements from this engagement. I want the lockup to end. Now you're wondering why? Because I know that the enemy fighters can strafe out of that lockup if they've still got, say, 2 fighters remaining or more, and they can damage my fighters, and it means I can't take out that squadron. So I want to put the enemy Ryujo in a position where they lose that fighter squad, and so they do. And now in return it means that my fighters can go hunting the enemy bombers and the enemy catapult fighter. Starting in particular with the catapult fighter, so that way it's out of the way and it's not going to hinder my bombers, and then I'll go on and attach the other torpedo bomber squadron, so that way I can prevent it from attacking the fleet, i.e. my friendly fleet. In return I switch my target towards the Fuso of my bombers, although I make a mistake here of not noticing that the Duke has turned back towards its teammates and deploys defensive AA right at the last moment, meaning that my dive bombers, I lose one of them and they miss the target completely. But fortunately enough, I'm able to catch the New Mexico right as it's trying to make a turn, and my torpedo bombers are going to have a field day here. As they go in, we lose one of them, but in return, as we're going to see, we strike with 4 torpedoes. And having already taken out 1 torpedo bomber squadron, we're now going to eliminate the remnant dive bomber squadrons. And having knocked off 24,000 health of that enemy New Mexico, this has been an absolutely brilliant opening in my personal experience, whereby we've practically taken out all of the enemy air presence to start with, the opening engagement, and we've also crippled an enemy battleship. Now there will be some of you out there who can do it much better than I and would be able to eliminate all the planes at this point, and you're welcome to provide suggestions on how I may have done this more effectively and indeed throughout the course of the game. But I'm quite proud at how this has started off. But enough time for gloating. What I'm doing with my ship right now is I'm rotating it close to the front line. Now you may be thinking, why would you do that in a carrier? Well, I personally feel the closer I am to the front line, the shorter the time it takes for my planes to get back and reload. And therefore, in return, it means that the effective reload time of all my aircraft is shorter than that of my opponent, who has to travel a much further distance, if they're not going with the fleet as well. Unfortunately, here I get caught up in a lock-up against the enemy Ryujo's fighters. They brought a second squadron about, but I'm hoping that with 6 planes in my squadron compared to the 5 in the Ryujo's, and the fact that my fighters have a reputation of being very strong, as is typical of the American aircraft carrier line from what I understand, I'll be able to grind down that enemy fighter squadron and leave it on, say, 1 fighter and lose all of my own, alternatively win this engagement. And it seems as though I'm going to win it by a small margin. In the meantime, I'm pulling myself back because what I've noticed is the enemy Königsberg is really pushing down onto the Juliet line of the minimap, meaning that if I was staying in the position that I was originally in, I would have been spotted by now, or about to be spotted, and I would have been a sitting duck for the enemy Fuso. So I'm just pulling away a little bit and using my great concealment at sea, I had detectability of 10 kilometers to stay hidden. By air it's a little bit longer, 11.5 kilometers, which means if you are going to stay close to the lead elements of your fleet, you'll need to position yourself behind landmasses so that way you can't be shot at directly. And that's what you'll notice I'm doing wherever possible. When I move up, I put myself next to a landmass so that way I'm not a sitting duck target. I'm very difficult to shoot at, particularly for enemy ships with low shell arcs. We won the enemy fighter engagement there, and we're now bringing our fighters back to rearm. But this is where we're going to be punished somewhat because I actually made a significant mistake. I haven't cancelled my retreat southwest of my ship, which means my fighters have to travel a longer distance. And in return that means that the 40-second reload for my fighters becomes more and more punishing by the second as I drift further and further southwest. I'm too preoccupied in trying to take this Fuso out, which once I've eliminated them from the game with my team, that means that's 1 enemy battleship out the game. But in return, by now I could have reacted to the fact that my carrier was no longer under threat by the enemy Königsberg, which died ages ago, but I'm too busy watching the beauty of seeing torpedoes strike an enemy battleship in the aft. But still, we learn. And with that, you'll note that I now send my dive bombers to take on the enemy New York, because whilst I haven't got any torpedo bombers to cause flooding after I've set fires with my dive bombers, or vice versa, if I can set a fire on the enemy New York and take away their fire extinguisher for a given period of time, either rechargeable consumable, it means that if my teammates throw their own high explosive towards that New York or their own torpedoes to cause flooding, that is going to stick and do bleed damage. We set the fire and note immediately the New York puts the fire out by the fact we're not getting any tick damage anymore in the top right corner of our screen, which confirms our overall plan, and now we just need to wait for our teammates to potentially take the New York out of the game through additional bleed. In the meantime, I now start to move my carrier back towards the southeastern corner of the map. I've realised my mistake and I'm rushing back over there because it appears as though our team is now drifting that way and the enemy team has won down the western side, with 2 New Mexicos in particular pushing towards Objective Charlie. Now unfortunately here, as our fighters get ready to take off, and they're starting to now, we bump into a little bit of a problem. Here I'm going to be useless for my team. Now you may be thinking at this point, okay, why? The enemy Cleveland in particular, and I have to be careful with the enemy Cleveland, has very powerful anti-aircraft, and I must assume that it's got the AA build, i.e. 7.2 km AA range, and therefore it'll be able to shred my planes if they're kept within that radius. Therefore I cannot help our friendly Alba, the tier 6 Japanese cruiser, which is currently in Objective Charlie, nor can I help my friendly Koenig unless the enemy aircraft come from the eastern side of our friendly battleship. Therefore for now I have to take a sit back and wait role. I have to wait for the opportune moment to arrive. And what you'll notice, I'll be migrating all of my planes down the eastern side of the map. I'm rotating myself around the anti-aircraft batteries of the enemy team, or where the majority of them are based. This is now becoming a counterclockwise rotation engagement, and I need to correspond to that. What I can do if I want to is send my planes out towards the southwestern corner and drift them up the very western edge of the map to attack the New Mexicos, but we'll do that a little bit later when the situation becomes a bit more dire, because at the moment there's opportunities opening up in the north. In particular the New Mexico that's retreating after being blasted very heavily earlier, retreating through Bravo right now. Therefore, I'm trying to make sure I've got aircraft available, and here you can see my frustration. I want to hit these torpedo bombers that are coming out of friendly Koenig, but unfortunately I can't, because if I strafe, I'll drift right across the top of the enemy Cleveland. If I pursue, I'll do exactly the same. There's nothing I can do here except provide a screen from the enemy bombers drifting further south towards the main elements of our fleet. Unfortunately for us, our Koenig only takes one torpedo, good play to them, and they don't take too much dive bomber damage either. You can see I'm trying to set up a strafe, but I know it's not possible. And therefore, the Koenig's actually going to frustrate the enemy team for a much longer period of time than perhaps they anticipated. And in return, I'm going to hunt down this New Mexico who's got no AA cover bar their own, and I'll be able to take them out of the game. I only need 1 or 2 torpedoes to hit them on the aft section, and therefore I can take them out, as they do have a good amount of torpedo protection, so I'm not expecting it to be an easy 1 torpedo hit kill, despite the fact our torpedo damage is a maximum of 9,867. We're going for the strike, and despite losing perhaps 1 torpedo bomber here, we're able to hit the 2 torpedoes, and it's enough, and we don't lose any torpedo bombers either, but I typically expect to lose 1 in an engagement like that. And funnily enough, we even detonated the New Mexico when they had very little health, so they should see that as a prize for receiving all those flags. But nonetheless, sarcasm aside, we look towards Objective Charlie, and what we can see is the enemy New Mexico and the enemy Cleveland are taking it, the enemy Cleveland being in a smokescreen. So we've got no ability to push that objective currently, instead we need to wait. Now what I can do is set up a 2-pronged attack. I can let my fleet shoot from what effectively is the southeastern corner of the map, and I can come in from the southwest, catching the enemy battleships in a perpendicular cross. Now by doing so, I'm not saying that I'm going to minimise the number of planes I lose, but what it means is the enemy ships have to expose broadside either to my incoming assault, alternatively to my team. And in return, I'm making my way southeast, staying with the fleet, so that way I'm not going to get caught off guard to these enemy battleships which can rip me to pieces. What their wonderful array of 4x3 turrets. Bringing in my dive bombers at this point, I'm going to focus on the less well guarded New Mexico, which is the one behind the lead New Mexico, conversely. The logic being here, because they're on the edge of their allied New Mexico's anti-aircraft batteries, I have to spend less time in the anti-aircraft zones. And having lost only 1 dive bomber, we strike with 2 bombers, and we also set a fire. Now we start to pull back. At this point, I'm going to bait the enemy torpedo bombers into the southwestern corner, because I want the enemy carrier to think I'm based down here. And watch what happens. The enemy torpedo bombers keep following my dive bombers, and I bring my fighters on. Now the fighters will ward off the enemy torpedo bombers, eventually. But at the same time, what we can see is the enemy carrier plane now knows that I'm over in the southeast, or I've got to be on the eastern side of the map. But they've wasted all that time in sending 1 set of torpedo bombers to follow my dive bombers to no avail. And that's something you can do by constantly changing up your direction and your position of your carrier. You can frustrate the enemy team in wondering where exactly you are. I'm bringing my fighters up again. They're quite close to the Mutsu here, which means I'm able to protect them from a considerable amount of dive bomber damage. Being able to hit those dive bombers as they come in, and also catch the other squadron with the remnant portion of my strafe. And it means that those dive bombers were not able to do considerable damage, and now I can finish them off. But then I know the torpedo bombers coming in, and I decide at this point just to pursue rather than strafe. Perhaps it was not the best option, but the idea being here the strafe may have not done any damage, but just simply grazed them, as I saw earlier against the enemy fighters who tried to strafe my own fighters early on. So instead I decide to spread out the torpedoes, our Mutsu only taking 1 rather than say 3 there, and we wipe out that entire torpedo bomber squadron. Which means at this point the enemy Ryujo has got a lot less planes left available compared to their starting capacity of 48 versus our starting capacity of 37, and we've still got the ability to fully replenish squads, which means we're in a good position even though the game is now 13 minutes in. We've been able to use our aircraft and we can still use them at maximum potential. Which means now as my dive bombers take off again, I can start to prey on the enemy New Mexicos, which are going to be a problem because there's a lot of anti-aircraft there, but I've got some planes to soak up that anti-aircraft fire. The enemy Cleveland is coming through the middle of the map, and it means that I have to relocate my planes south of that, so that way they're not caught up in the AA radius. But as we can see, that Cleveland is really starting to become aggressive, and soon they are going to bite off more than they can chew. By the looks of things, it'll be our remnant New Mexico who takes them out, based on the positioning at the moment. In the meantime, dive bombers up, torpedo bombers south of the 2 enemy New Mexicos. I'm getting ready to strike the southernmost one. As whilst it has more health than the other one, it's going to be south of the AA of the other New Mexico, and therefore I have to travel through less AA to be able to strike it. I send my dive bombers in first to try and flatten some of the AA guns and set a fire, and now bring the torpedo bombers in afterwards. The idea being here that I can try and keep my torpedo bombers alive for longer, as they're going to do considerably more damage if I can get all of them to hit, compared to the dive bombers. Coming in with the manual drop here, lining up hopefully to do a good amount of damage. We're just going to catch the New Mexico right on the bow. And we can see we set 2 fires and land 3 bombs on them, and now the torpedo bombers are on their way in. Here, one could say I do make a bit of a mistake. I tried to go for the southernmost New Mexico, but they turn in towards their ally, and I continue on my pursuit, which means I'm going to sail right into the jaws of death. But I decide to focus the other New Mexico, which I know I only need to hit once or twice here with torpedoes to get them out of the game. Now it's a nasty trade here, because what it means is I'm going to be losing this entire squadron, or the vast majority of it. But in return, it means I'm able to take out one battleship, so it's an exact trade. And because I've been able to conserve planes throughout this game, it means that despite losing this torpedo bomber here by making the mistake of retreating too early before I'm outside the AA of the remnant New Mexico, I've still got 5 torpedo bombers remaining, which means I'm practically able to get a full squadron out. And now I can go pursue the final New Mexico on the enemy team. In the meantime, my fighters have got very little to do now other than escort the friendly destroyer on our team, the Young Wei, who's up in Objective Alpha at the moment. And I can see that dive bombers are really starting to harass them. So I'm bringing my fighters up, and I'm going to be positioning them over the top of Objective Alpha, or just off to the southeastern side of it, so that way the Yang Wei's got a fighter screen to protect them from incoming bombers, and on top of that, what they have to consider is the fact that they do not know where the Graf Spee is right now, and I want to detect that for them. I can see from the catapult fighter that's drifting around, that must be the Graf Spees, and I'm moving my planes into a position whereby we'll find the Graf Spee. There we go. Pardon me. And we're able to pursue down and eliminate these remnant dive bombers. We're unable to get in before they drop by the looks of things, but we'll at least catch them on their retreat. I've only got dive bombers remaining at the moment. The torpedo bombers are taking off currently, so I'm going to wait until both sets are ready before striking the enemy battleship once more. Now pursuing the enemy dive bombers up in the north, we'll see that we'll shoot down a couple more planes at this point, and that'll put the Ryujo practically out the game. They'll have no planes left. And our fighters are also spotting the enemy Graf Spee right now and giving our Young Wei information of which they'll need to be able to take that objective and torpedo the Graf Spee. Our dive bombers going first, so that way we can whittle down the AA guns in that New Mexico and reset their capture progress. And now we're sending in our torpedo bombers, scoring 2 fires in the enemy New Mexico. And here I make the mistake of not realising that the enemy New Mexico is turning in underneath my torpedo bombers, which means that I'm going to miss with the vast majority of this drop, scoring only 1 torpedo here. I was hoping to perhaps change up the directionality at the last minute, but I didn't react fast enough to this, and it means that I'm going to lose a considerable chunk of this squadron once more. Going down to 4, then 3, then 2. Unfortunately, our torpedo bombers have seen their last flight, by looks of things, or at least the majority of them, as there's 2 remaining. And it means they're not going to be able to really get in on the target. And having briefly been spotted by the enemy New Mexico, we're fortunate enough to only take 1 citadel by looks of things and 2 penetrations while their lead turrets. Meaning that as we reposition ourselves behind the island in what is Hotel 9 at this point, we're going to be staying here and bringing up our planes in order to try and continuously strike them and get them out of the game. But note how, because we're positioned behind the landmass here rather than sitting out in the open, if the New Mexico wants to finish us off, they will have to come for us and take the longest possible route, i.e. going round the landmass. We're not making it easy for them. And in return that means we get more and more time to be able to strike the blighter. Getting all of our planes up at this point, we want to go in with both our torpedo bombers and our dive bombers together to try and spread the anti-aircraft guns of that New Mexico. And we'll attack from 2 sides, either torpedo bombers coming in from the south, our dive bombers coming in from the southeast. And with our dive bombs going in already, and note we're able to get another squadron up because we still had some planes remaining. And we're bringing in the 2 torpedo bombers as well. We're coming in, dropping the bombs. And again, with a manual drop, we set 2 more fires and get 3 hits at this point. And we're able to do a little bit of bleed damage here with our fires. Our torpedo bombers are now going in. We brought them a little bit too late. And unfortunately, despite knocking out a considerable chunk of the New Mexico's AA, they've still got more than enough to be able to bring down our bombers before they're able to drop. So now it's all going to be down to our dive bombers. As our bombers go in, don't drop any of the torpedoes. It's all down to our dive bombers and what our Young Wei can do up in the northwest of the map. And they've done a very good job taking Alpha, taking Bravo, which means we've got 2 objectives against the enemy's 2 objectives. They just need to take out a ship. Alternatively, I need to take out a ship at this point. Now type into the chat to the Young Wei, you need to kill someone if you want us to win this if I can't get a kill, and I need to play essentially evasive and just keep doing circles around this landmass. My dive bombers all die when they take off next. But hopefully, just hopefully, as they start to take fire from the New Mexico who's put out their fires, we can get 1 more drop in and set another fire and get them out of the game. Let's see if the guys can do it. We'll go in for the manual drop, and fingers crossed.
Approaching target. Returning.
And fortunately for us, Our attack prevails, we pick up an arsonist, and that puts the point score in the favour of our team right at the end of the match with just under a minute remaining. Our young Wei can now take on the enemy Ryujo without the hesitation of having to definitely kill it. He can just throw some deep water torpedoes in on it. The Graf Spee seems to be just sitting south of Objective Alpha and not really trying to protect its carrier, more so retreating away it looks like, and our fighters providing that intelligence to our teammate. And here we can just relax in the south eastern corner of the map and know that all of our planes did their job to their best ability, as we decide to be cheeky and take out the catapult fighter of the enemy Graf Spee of our fighters, sneaking in here and grabbing the quick kill. And it looks as though Yang Wei almost got the Ryujo out of the game, just missing with one set of torpedoes. That fighter's out the game. Now we can go back to the carrier and have just enough time for tea. So let's just see our boys head home, and it looks as though our dive bombers are getting up just in case they wait to take on the Graf Spee, but they won't have enough time. Time for the post-game stats. Now that was a rather close game, but in the end we were able to help clutch it for our team, and our battle performance as a result of it consisted of 109,430 HP of damage, and we also picked up the standard achievement of Arsonist for setting an enemy ship on fire and destroying it, whereby the damage caused by fire must exceed 40% of the destroyed ship's normal health pool, that being on the final New Mexico on the enemy team. Coming on to the team scores, we can see that we topped our team in terms of base experience earned, picking up 2,012. We did not carry our team to victory, we did our best to support our team to victory, even in some difficult circumstances where we had limited room to operate, especially when the enemy Cleveland really pushed into the centre of the map and confined the regions where our planes could go and where they could not go. But in the end, despite some mistakes, particularly drops on the enemy New Mexicos towards the end of the game, we're able to help our team pull through. And a special mention should go to our friendly Yang Wei, i.e. the Tier 5 Pan-Asian destroyer, who did a brilliant job of taking the objectives up in the north to keep our team in the fight whilst we were trying to get the drops off against the enemy ships. On top of that, looking at the enemy team, we can see that their New Mexico in particular, i.e. one of the many New Mexicos, was able to top by a considerable margin, picking up 1,819 base experience. And they should be commended for doing a brilliant job, although unfortunately for them it was not enough to gain the victory for their team today. Coming on to our detailed report, we have two key items to note here. The first is the proportion of our total damage output, which was made up of fire damage. Approximately 1/3 of our total output can be attributed to the 10 fires we set, going to highlight the importance of using bleed damage effectively over the course of a given match in a carrier to help whittle down the health states of enemy ships, particularly enemy battleships. And I personally feel that whilst we used fires rather effectively in this match, particularly towards the end against the enemy New Mexico, we did not use our flooding effectively, whereby the 5 floods we caused only dealt 1,825 HP of damage, not even 1% of our total damage output, so I do need to work on that. The other item to note is the amount of distance we travelled over the course of the game, i.e. 72.4 kilometres. This goes to show that life in a carrier is not all about being static in one portion of the map, but relocating to make sure you're in a safe spot and able to send out your planes from an ideal position in relation to where your team are positioned, minimising the amount of time it takes for your planes to fly back to rearm, and at the same time making sure that you're always safe from any potential flanking by the enemy team, so that way you can stay in the game for longer. And I personally feel here we may have travelled a lot more distance than the good chunk of our teammates. That's not a criticism, just purely an observation. And finally, coming on to our credits and experience earned, we can see that after additions and deductions, we walked away 403,786 silver credits and 6,036 commander experience. To conclude, hopefully today we've demonstrated the value of preserving one's aircraft as an aircraft carrier captain, whereby it's all well and good to have that initial high impact in the match, whereby you may be able to drop your bombs and your torpedoes on an overextending destroyer or enemy cruiser at the start and get them out the game completely before they've been able to have their own impact. But the question I personally find you have to ask yourself is, am I doing enough so that my planes are able to not only have an impact now, but as the game goes on? Am I preserving my aircraft for the later stages where it could really make a difference between a loss or a victory? And here I personally think we answered that question successfully by deploying our bombers in such a fashion so they always provided the safety net of friendly AA or alternatively our fighters, and they're able to take advantage of opening opportunities such as the exposed Fuso, who extended outside of the AA of friendly ships. And by taking those small opportunities we're able to help our team drop down the number of enemy ships facing against them, but more importantly we had our bombers available for when it really mattered, at the end with the 2 New Mexicos bearing down on our position. and whilst we did have to throw our bombers in against the onslaught of AA, we had ample supplies left available, despite our limited number of aircraft being 37 units in total for the Independence, to be able to continuously strike these battleships and eventually get them out the game. In other words, we ended up going the distance for our team and helping them achieve the victory. And so I've been TX141, and if you have enjoyed this video, why not leave a like, comment or subscribe for future World of Warships videos on my channel. But until next time, ladies and gentlemen, take care and fair seas.